I feel like I'm about to take my driver's exam, but don't worry, I'm not picturing you in your underwear. I'll just jump in. I don't want you to think that my life was a tragedy, and then it all came together. There were times and places in my past that I would never trade. I was a child of the oil sands prior to the boom, when people would work 7 12-hour days in a row, and children were disciplined in shifts. No one worked 9 to 5 except the people at the post office. With a mother who was sick and often under a lot of stress, I would spend a lot of time on my own, daydreaming, planning pranks, or being a little Tykes carpenter or chef. When I was in 2nd grade, my mother surprised me with a diary, and I began to document my experiences as I learned the ins and outs of the English language. My daydreaming had turned to written, childish stories of toucans, goldfish, and any other creatures that I could anthropomorphize. And later on, attempts to write guidebooks on wild felines. Whenever my dad had the chance to be there, he would sit in his chair, read, and smoke his pipe. I loved his company and more than anything wanted to spend time. Although after long, hard shifts on an oil rig, there was no option but for him to relax. I would set up a brown fleece blanket, lay seashells on it, and pretend that I was at the beach. I never thought that one day I would lay in a similar blanket and pretend I was at home. I know that my parents fought, and I know this because I used to repeat their conversations with my finger puppets as a child, and I'd always get in trouble for using their bad words. It was a good thing that they weren't reading what I had written in my diary when I was 13. Smack dab in the middle of learning about attraction and romance, the dramas of young friends in school, I was hit with the news, and my father had to leave the home because otherwise it wasn't safe for us to be there. I was angry and frustrated with all parties involved, and even though I'm sure they were just doing their jobs. I blamed myself for his exile, and deep down I think I still might. As with any situation out of your control, we search for answers as a coping mechanism, and to blame yourself just helps make it make sense sometimes. It was a culture shock when we came to Ontario, where people didn't speak to one another while waiting in line. The weather was warm, and people asked my mom questions such as, "Do your children all have the same father?" I didn't want to face my mother because the wound was still quite raw. I searched for friends and found them in the wrong places. Caught up in the excitement, I was learning all the wrong lessons about the big city. Within 4 months of my landing, I found myself in serious trouble with the law. After word broke out about what I had done, the neighbors harassed my mom, calling her names for raising such a bad child. It was her fault that I was lost, and despite her not knowing how to be there for me, the point was that she was trying. We fought endlessly and spoke words to each other that we couldn't take back. My sentencing led to jail time, and for months I was more alone and desperate for grounding than ever before. No one could be there for me if they wanted to, but it was my fault. Upon my release, my mother and I saw eye to eye that I disturbed the homeostasis of the household, and I didn't feel at home. I found the warmth I was looking for in the freedom of the highway, and made it with my thumb. I was a few weeks past 16, with a $50 bill that I had stolen from her purse and a backpack, and I was off in the dead of winter before anyone in the house awoke. On that trip, I learned lessons about survival that I will never forget. I've never been as cold, as tired, or as hungry as I was then. I called my mom from a small town called Espanola at the end of the first night to tell her that I loved her and I was sorry for what I had done because I wasn't sure if I was going to make it. Since I couldn't return to my father's, I forged on to the dreamland where the mountains met the ocean and found myself in Vancouver. If Leonard Nimoy could live here, maybe my dreams had a chance. Consistent with big dreams and no means, I ended up squatting and surviving off of fast food scraps and cheap pizza. I never felt more free than I was sitting on the back of the Lion at the gallery, watching the people to the white noise of the ocean. But I wasn't hardcore enough to stay here. So I determined that the time had come to return with my tail between my legs. I called my mom and begged, and she spent her last few dollars on a bus ticket home for me, and it was the longest 4 days of my life. The empty bedroom had built a sense of permanence, and my family had built a fortress around themselves to protect them from me. This is when I realized that there was no chance things could be the same. I rented a room, but when they found the paraphernalia of my escapist remedy, the needles, they were all too happy to have me out. I moved to a rooftop downtown where I could brag that my digs had a patio. It reminded me of Mary Poppins being on the rooftops of London, and that made me smile. The hum of a climate control unit killed the silence and the ringing in my ears so that I could sleep, and the church bells always had me up in time for school. I was in grade 11 at the time, and my diaries were filling up with new ideas about philosophy. I lived vicariously through the people that I would ask for change, and I dreamed that I had a mortgage and credit card debt. I was harassed for my lifestyle by police and randomly searched, given tickets that I couldn't afford to pay. For the most part, officers didn't understand my choice of why I would be more comfortable there than a shelter. Others didn't care. They were just doing their jobs. The Youth Action Center gave me a break in the day where I could come in from the heat or the cold. They allowed me to shower and gave me clean needles. I think that was for the safety of others. They also gave me fresh water to protect my life. They knew they couldn't stop me, but they could keep me safe in the hopes that I would make my own decision to stop. After being busted on what we used to call a bullshit drug charge, come on, I was a user, I faced more jail time. The arresting officer was the same one who had helped me through a sexual assault, and he told me he was doing it to help me turn my life around. I did a little time, but was released to the custody of my mother. I cleaned up and tried to find work. She was scared that I'd return to old habits since I carried on relationships within the same circles. After all was said and done with the courts, I was out again. I took this opportunity to move into a new apartment with a sleeping bag and a backpack, and I started to build my life, playing house as I learned how to live with responsibility. I began to reconnect with my family, which has almost taken a decade to date, but the challenge has been a worthwhile one. A few months later, I was hired by Youth Opportunities Unlimited to help write a book to illustrate homelessness in London, the Flying a Sign Project. It was writing my dream job, and the journals that I had kept finally found a niche. I asked my mother to write a piece for it, and when I read it, I had a realization. What I interpreted as insensate behavior was just her response to being as scared as I was. She was always there for me, I just didn't know how to ask for help. After the 8-month learning experience, where I met the two greatest life coaches one could dream of, Trevor Johnson and Brian De Wagner, I had enough confidence to fight a little harder for what it was that I wanted. A solace in the kitchen of a restaurant where I could expend the energy and put things in front of people that make them smile. To be trusted with one of the very things that brings people together. Now I have a gorgeous border collie, Hunter, and I am a Red Seal chef who speaks to her mom and dad regularly. And I am a homeowner. I don't have to pretend anymore. Thank you.